If we sort of ignore the short-lived emperors of the Heraclean dynasty like Constantine III and Heracleonis, what we're left with are four Heraclean emperors who had a chance to make an impact on the world. And of those four, Heraclius and his great-great-grandson, Justinian II, are by far the best known. Heraclius was this heroic figure who defeated the Persians and then died a broken man after the Arab invasions, and Justinian II was this almost evil but absolutely fascinating figure who simply would not relinquish power and ultimately died in the pursuit of imperial authority. So that leaves Constans II and his son Constantine IV left in the lurch a bit. They accomplished pretty important things in their own right, and they're absolutely worthy of the Heraclean name. But they rarely get as much credit because they don't really have an iconic moment in the same way that someone like Heraclius or Justinian II does. Although, it's not that they don't have those iconic moments, it's simply that those moments are far less known. And in the case of Constans II, as we'll see, the thing that would make him one of Byzantium's greatest emperors is something that hasn't quite been completely proven in terms of whether or not he was the primary driver of this reform. Of course, the reform I'm referring to is the implementation of the thematic system. But we'll get into all that in due time. So let's take a look at Constans II the Bearded, who ruled from 641 until 668. Let's do a brief review to let everyone remember how Constans II is related to all of the foregoing members of the Heraclean dynasty. So he's the grandson of Heraclius, and he is the son of Constantine III and his wife Gregoria. In addition, he's the nephew of Heracleonis, who was a son of Heraclius by his second wife Martina. And if we'll recall, Heraclius and Martina were uncle and niece. So actually, you could make an argument that there are other ways you could say that they're related, but the most direct one is as uncle and nephew if we're talking about Heracleonis and Constans II. So about Constans' name, he was actually baptized as Heraclius, but for reasons that should become abundantly clear when we talk about how he actually got the crown put on his head in the first place, he was given the regnal name of Constantine. But later on, the diminutive Constans became standard in Byzantine historiography for reasons that I don't understand, and it just stuck. So that's why we call him Constans II, even though in his own time he reigned as Constantine. He was born in 630, so that means that during the turmoil of 641, he was 11 years old. So old enough to know what's going on, kind of, but not quite old enough to really play a leading role. So let's do a year in review for 641, since this is a date with four different emperors wearing a crown and exercising imperial authority, and one empress to boot. So in February of 641, the long-suffering Heraclius finally died, and that left his son Constantine III, who would have been in his late 20s, and Heracleonis, who would have been a bit younger, somewhere in his teens, on the throne as co-emperors. Now, Constantine III died in May of that year, and then there was suspicion about his death that surrounded Heracleonis, but mostly it surrounded Martina, Heracleonis' mother. And the reason for this suspicion was that Martina and Heraclius had been uncle and niece, and that people had seen this as an impious arrangement. In addition, Heracleonis was actually their fourth son as a couple, but he was the first one who did not have developmental disabilities and who was capable of ruling the empire. So, because of this, there was a lot of discontent surrounding the idea of having Martina running the show in the name of her son Heracleonis, and there was some popular support for the, I guess, elder line of the Heraclean dynasty, which would be represented by the heirs of Constantine III. And also, it's actually not all that likely that Martina had anything to do with Constantine III's death. He was not in good health throughout his entire life. He was sickly. even as a young man. He probably had something like cancer or something of that nature, and it was slowly eating away at him, so he ended up only living until May. Um, and what ended up happening is that on his deathbed, it looks like Constantine III had given money and support to a general named Valentinus on the understanding that Valentinus would back young Constans against Martina and Heracleonis when, Constantine kicked the bucket, which looked like it was coming soon, and he predicted correctly. So what happens is that Valentinus and others in the capital agitate and force Heracleonis and Martina to have Constans II crowned as a co-emperor. And at that time, he would have taken the name Constantine because that would remind people of his father and his sort of taking up the mantle of his father and that legitimate line of the family. I guess he also could have used his personal name Heraclius. That would have been fine, I imagine, since that recalled the grandfather. But maybe people had gotten a little sick of Heraclius by that point because his last years had been a bit disappointing, and he probably had to be kept out of the public eye to some extent. At any rate, what ends up happening is a few months later, after Constans is crowned at some point in the summer, Valentinus and his troops forcibly remove Martina and Heracleonis in September of 641, and they inflict mutilation and then send them into exile. If you want to learn more about that, I have videos on both Martina and Heracleonis that you can check out. While most modern scholars are pretty skeptical of the idea that Martina had Constantine III killed, that was something that was current among lots of people in the capital because they simply didn't like her and that's what they wanted to believe. So young Constans II gave a speech in front of the Senate where he basically repeated that story and said that Martina definitely killed his father and that he thanked all the people present for helping him to avenge his father's death. And then the Senate set up a council of regency for the young ruler, and this council was headed by the Patriarch Paul II and a few other prominent senators. Also, this is a good time to mention that it looks like the Byzantine Senate retained almost all of the functions of the old Roman Senate, at least as the Roman Senate had functioned in the imperial period. There's actually a newish book out about that topic by Anthony Caldelis. I haven't had the chance to read it, but I know a few people who have, and it's something I would definitely want to check out in the near future. Maybe I'll even make a video about it at some point. At any rate, from what I can gather, it looks like the Regency probably ended around 646, and this is just a subjective evaluation. Also, it's one that John Julius Norwick made, of all people, and although he's not the world's most reliable source of information, he did make a good point. We'll see that in that year, Constans will issue an edict on religion that will show off his autocratic character and will sort of be in keeping with what we know of his character. So, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and guess 646, but I don't really know for certain. I think usually you were considered to be a full adult at about the age of 15 during this period. So it would also add up in that regard. He would have been about 15 or 16 when that document would have been released. So it all kind of fits together. If we've learned anything from Roman and Byzantine history, it should be that anytime you have an emperor who's too young, too old, has no military experience, or is otherwise vulnerable, that person is going to be very vulnerable to coups by people who are well placed militarily. And the reign of Constans II bears this out once again. So, his key supporter early on was one of his father's friends, General Valentinus, and it only took him a few years to decide to try to launch a coup against the emperor before he really reached his manhood. So Valentinus apparently was a descendant of the former dynasty in Armenia, the Arsacid dynasty, which was a sub-branch of the old Parthian royal family. The Parthian Empire, of course, being the Persian Empire, which preceded the Sasanian Empire. Now, it's sort of an odd betrayal, given what we know of the circumstances, and also given how much control Valentinus already enjoyed of the government. So by around 642 or so, we know that Valentinus was the chief general of Byzantium, and he seems to have been someone who exercised power either in the Council of Regency or outside of it, but still was more or less able to direct affairs as he pleased. And that Constans II had married his daughter Fausta, someone who he never divorced, by the way, and would go on to have 3 children by, one of whom would go on to be emperor. In 643 to 44, Valentinus led out the Byzantine army to fight the Arabs. At one point, it looks like he had them caught in a pincer, but somehow he bungled, and he ended up being heavily defeated. And then the next year, 644 to 45, he decided to try to seize the throne. It's possible that people were calling him incompetent and that he was on the verge of losing his favor, and that this was an attempt to reclaim his relevance by force. I don't know the exact details, and I guess they're not really recorded, but at any rate, we know that the patriarch and the people of the city were not having it, and he and his messenger who announced that he was the new emperor were both torn to shreds by the crowd just right there in the streets or in the hippodrome or wherever they were at the time. Let's take a look at the world from the eyes of Constans II and his advisors. The world that he had inherited from his grandfather Heraclius was one that didn't hold out a ton of promise. He had inherited one of the greatest crises in Byzantine history, the Arab invasions. So this was going to be something that he'd have to resolve. His grandfather Heraclius had not been able to turn back the Arab invasions the same way that he had been able to deal with the Persian invasions. And as I suggested in my Heraclius video, part of the fault may lie with the fact that Heraclius had fatally weakened the Sasanians, and without an effective Sasanian state in place, the Arabs didn't have enough pressure put upon them from the east. At any rate, by the time that Constans II was on the throne, and this is something that would have been perhaps truer for his regents than for himself, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine were all lost. Egypt, Armenia, and eastern Anatolia were now under constant threat from Arab armies. At this point, it's probably not yet clear to the people living at the time that these losses were permanent, but what was very clear is that with the eastern provinces in enemy hands, Byzantium's revenue was greatly diminished. In addition, the Balkans had been overrun under Heraclius' leadership, so the empire was without one of its major recruiting centers and also some of its revenue as well. So that meant that the place that they were having to rely upon for most of their recruiting and most of their revenue was Anatolia. So this was sort of the grand strategic situation which faced Constans, and you can imagine that he and his generals were looking for opportunities to take back lands and restore governance there to add more resources and enable yet further conquest. One factor that they didn't seem to be able to cope with, however, was that the new invaders, the new occupiers of these lands, the Arabs, were generally relatively popular and well received by the native subjects in the regions because the Arabs, for the most part, were tolerant rulers during this period, and they also did not impose a very heavy tax burden. Let's backtrack for just a bit. So following the Battle of Yarmouk and the loss of the Near East to the Arab invaders, the Arab forces had then moved into Egypt and begun taking over the Byzantine possessions there starting in 639. When Heraclius had died in 641, that was still an ongoing battle, and this remained the case throughout the very short reigns of Constantine III and Heraclius. Well, young Constans II inherited this mess, and this was a war that the Byzantines were very clearly losing. In 642, Alexandria had been under siege from an Arab army, and the Byzantine garrison there had negotiated their surrender and sailed out of Alexandria. Now, a few years later, a Byzantine fleet under a commander named Manuel will return with an army and recapture Alexandria, but after about a year or so, he will lose a major battle against an Arab army inland from Alexandria, and that will weaken his position enough that he'll be forced to then evacuate Egypt altogether once again in 646. and then after that, the Byzantines more or less give up their design of reconquering Egypt. Now, one common myth that a lot of people believe is that the Great Library at Alexandria was destroyed during the Arab invasions. Most likely it was burned down before that due to neglect and rioting in the city. If it did still stand in the 640s, then it's very likely that this library had already been long denuded of all of its scrolls and books. It looks like quite a few people, anecdotally, we hear of people taking scrolls from the library. So, most likely anything that had been there was either gone in terms of having been stolen or just having been neglected and allowed to rot. So, this myth is something that really needs to be busted. Despite the grave crisis facing the Byzantine Empire, a Christian empire, from a new enemy which had a new religion, theological debates among Christians proceeded as if nothing were to matter. And in 646, Orthodox and Monothelite Christians are still at odds over Christology, debating the energy and will of Christ and all of that stuff. Well, Constans II wasn't having any of that, so he issued an order called the typos, meaning type, and this basically assigned punishments for any continued talk about the issue. So if you were a bishop and you tried to bring this up, you would be removed from your see, and there were punishments for bureaucrats and soldiers and all kinds of people, usually involving the loss of your position. I think if you're a senator, you lose your property. Anyway, what this is it's more or less the first real showing of Constans' autocratic style of rule. You would think that someone who came up under the tutelage of the Senate would be a little more collegial and be a little bit more open to discussion and debate, but that was not the personality of Constans, and we'll see that this is a personality that he passed on to his son and grandson in the course of time. And that's also why this is usually the date that a lot of people look to as when the regency ended and Constans II began to really rule in his own right. Now, of course, if you tell a bunch of Christian bishops that they're not allowed to debate theology, you're basically telling them that they can't do their job. So in 649, Pope Martin I in Rome convened a council and they condemned the typos. And apparently they did so in relatively mild language, though, so far as condemnations go. But it's still enough to absolutely infuriate young Constans II, and we'll see in due time how he responds to that. So, as is so often the case, when emperors try to intervene in religious affairs, sometimes things blow up in their faces. The exarch Gregory in Carthage revolted against the empire that same year in 646. Some people have speculated that this revolt was inspired by his opposition to Constans' typos. It could also have just been a purely opportunistic thing that was done because Gregory is now going to face a great crisis and he would be better off having no one to answer to if he's going to try to deal with this great invasion in North Africa. However, Arab forces quickly swept through Gregory's army, which supposedly was 120,000 men, and they were able to conquer North Africa, killing Gregory the usurper in the process. Keep in mind, one of the key advantages that the Arabs enjoyed in North Africa is that there were heavy Bedouin populations nearby, and the Bedouins tended to be militarily compatible with the Arabs, and the Bedouin also tended to be fairly open to joining with the Arabs and often converting to Islam as well. So basically there was they could recruit on the fly as they're invading some of these areas in North Africa. At any rate, later on, a bit of a side note, there will be a caliphal civil war. We'll get into the details of that later. And the Byzantines will then be able to dispatch an expedition to Africa and reclaim Carthage during that 5-year period when Muawiyah and Ali are fighting over the title of Caliph. At the same time that Constans would have been receiving news about the usurpation of his exarch in Carthage and then his subsequent death at the hands of yet another Arab army, He would also have been receiving news about setbacks on his own eastern frontier. So in 647, Arab forces won major victories in Armenia and then managed to penetrate deep into Cappadocia, which up to this time had been holding out. The central Anatolian city of Caesarea was destroyed, and that was a major defeat for the Byzantines. In addition, a couple years later in 650, Arab forces managed to capture the Syrian coastal city of Aradus. There were more Arab offensives into Cilicia and Isauria in 650 and 651, and at that point, the Arab armies were getting far too close to Constan's source of power, and he was looking to, have a truce to regroup. The opponent who directed pretty much all of these operations, either directly or indirectly, was the governor of Syria, Muawiyah. And because Muawiyah will figure so prominently in affairs between the Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire, I think that it's worth looking at Muawiyah in detail. So Muawiyah had been born in Mecca in 602, and he was the governor in Syria from about 639 onward. His clan was called the Umayyad clan. They were not directly related to the clan of Muhammad's family, but they were still a very well-placed clan with a long history in the city of Mecca. And as such, members of their family tended to be highly regarded and also had to be appeased politically. So from about the time of his appointment in 639 until his death in 680, Muawiyah's primary aim was the conquest of Byzantium. Now, he was the great rival of Constans II because of this, and he would be the author of most of Constan's woes in his life. In addition, Muawiyah, because of his long life, would also go on to be the great rival of Constantine IV as well. And if we look over the course of Byzantine history, there aren't very many foes that they faced who are more formidable than Muawiyah. So, ultimately, right after the raids into Isauria and Cilicia, Constans II and Muawiyah struck an agreement to make a 2-year truce. But while you would think that this would favor the Byzantines, since they were clearly getting their asses kicked on all fronts, it actually ended up favoring the clever Muawiyah, who had plans for what to do during that 2-year stretch, whereas it doesn't seem like Constans II was going to be able to achieve all that much of note during those 2 years. So why would Muawiyah want to put a war on pause that he was winning? Well, he saw that to really crack Byzantium, he needed a navy that was strong. So earlier in 649, this would have been a whole year before his victory at Aradus and his raid into Isauria and Cilicia, he had led a fleet to Cyprus, where there were major Byzantine facilities. And while his fleet and the force on it had been strong enough to wreck the facilities there, they weren't strong enough to actually occupy the island. So he decided that he really needed to strengthen his fleet, both in terms of numbers and in terms of training. So he spent the years of the ceasefire building more ships and training his fleet more. And to do that, he had to get the Caliph to side with him. I believe the Caliph by this time was Uthman. So this was one of the most important decisions that the early Caliphate made. And Muawiyah was the guy to lead this force. And in 654, he put this large navy into action and managed to capture the important naval base at Rhodes, which was on the southern coast of western Anatolia. So that means that he now has a station from which to raid and promote invasions of Byzantine core territories. He doesn't have to rely on trying to penetrate the Taurus Mountains anymore. So that is a victory of monumental importance. And one thing that Muawiyah did at this time, which really outraged Byzantine opinion, is that he collected all of the scrap of the Colossus statue, which had been laying in the streets of Rhodes for centuries by this point, and he sold it all for scrap. And that really just created outrage, because a lot of people felt that their Hellenic heritage was being disrespected by, this desert-dwelling barbarian Muawiyah. So this sort of causes a little bit of bad blood, and obviously, the combination of this grand strategic threat and this callous disregard for Greek history demanded that Constans had to do something. So in 655, Constans personally gathered his fleet together and then set out to engage the Arab fleet. The two fleets ran into each other somewhere around a place called Phoenicius off the coast of Lycia, so this is also in the western portion of Asia Minor. And the battle was not a close one. Despite the fact that his navy was relatively new, Muawiyah's forces were far superior, and they completely crushed Constans' navy. Constans himself was only able to escape by trading clothes with one of his men, and when the Arab sailors saw that man dressed up like an emperor, they made sure that he died. So Constans had to return to the capital, most likely with a very shattered force. This is the first known instance of Constans II actually taking the field in person. He was now age 25, and you would expect that he would have done this sooner. Presumably, he needed time to really establish his legitimacy in the capital, maybe make sure that he had healthy children who were likely to live and come of age. Maybe it was just taking a long time to gather together a fleet and army because of the empire's resource restrictions. Really hard to know exactly why it took him so long. But given that the tradition from Maurice and Heraclius had been for the emperor to take the field, you would think that Constans II would have shown a little more haste in that regard. At any rate, another significant thing about the battle at Phoenicius is that this was the first open water naval battle between the Byzantines and the Arabs, and by extension between the Christians and Muslims. So I think the last major naval battle will be Lepanto, or maybe there are a couple after that. But at any rate, so that will sort of inaugurate nearly 1,000 years or so of naval battles between the East and the West. So now that he held Rhodes, had a strong fleet, and had defeated the Byzantine battle fleet, Muawiyah had a lot of options for doing tons of damage to the Byzantines. He could land in Asia Minor and try to conquer some of their core territories. He could try to gun for Constantinople while the Byzantines are reeling and demoralized. But ultimately what happens is that he receives news of the assassination of Caliph Uthman, someone he supported, and he learned that the next person who was claiming caliphal authority was Muhammad's nephew Ali. And Muawiyah was not a big fan of Ali, mostly because he was a member of the Umayyad clan, and as such, he didn't have quite the family clout of someone who had a blood relation to Muhammad. So he knew that if Ali gets into office and proves successful, that's a dangerous thing. And Muawiyah will then enter into a civil war with Ali. And this civil war is something that I don't really know the details of, so I won't say more lest I say something wrong. I do know that this war lasts for about 5 years, and during that time, Arab forces are mostly engaged in fighting each other rather than continuing their conquest. And this will give the Byzantines a lot of much-needed breathing room. Of course, this is the period, as I mentioned earlier, when Byzantine forces reclaimed North Africa, at least temporarily. But Constans will actually spend quite a bit of time fighting over Christology. And to be fair, while I put that comment in there partly as sarcasm and criticism, it's possible that that was just his pastime while he was rebuilding his shattered navy and army. So maybe the sources just don't record that because it's not quite as dramatic as what's about to happen next. So let's look at Constans the Bearded Autocrat and his dealings with the church in Rome. So just to review, in 646, Constans had forbidden any further discussion of Christological controversies, and then in 649, the Pope had held a meeting, and he and his fellow bishops had decided that the typos was illegitimate. Well, Constans was not going to take that sitting down, and he wasn't going to exchange reasoned letters with the Pope or have the Patriarch argue on his behalf. He decided to take a more vigorous stance. So he ordered his exarch in Ravenna, named Olympius, to arrest the Pope on the dubious grounds his election had not been approved in Constantinople. Olympius tried and failed to catch the Pope. For whatever reason, he wasn't able to pull it off. And supposedly, according to papal sources, which of course would say something like this, Olympius came to view the Pope as being divinely protected. Otherwise, how would he have evaded capture? Anyway, at some point, Olympius had made peace with the Pope and then tried to start a revolt once he realized how unpopular the Byzantines were in Italy. For whatever reason, that revolt never really got a lot of popularity, and then he retreated to Sicily with his army, and he was hanging out for a few years, and then he died. So it's really, as far as usurpations go, one of the least interesting to ever happen. With most emperors, if they had ordered something quite as dramatic as arresting a pope, you would think that if that failed miserably the first time and resulted in an attempt at usurpation, that they might let the issue drop. But Constans II was a member of the Heraclean dynasty, and he did not know the meaning of the word quit. So, he sent a new exarch to replace the recently fallen Olympius, and when that exarch arrived in Italy, he immediately moved on to Rome and captured Pope Martin, then brought him back to the east. So Martin spent an entire year imprisoned on the island of Naxos. It's not really clear why. If I had to guess, it's because maybe the sea lanes were not safe at this point, and maybe they were just looking for a time when they could ensure the safe passage of the Pope. Although most likely it had something to do with trying to soften him up or let public sentiment in his favor die down. I don't know. At any rate, by September of 654, he was finally brought to the capital after some 14 months of being under arrest. And then when he reached the capital, he was imprisoned for 93 days before the trial. So apparently Constans II did not believe in the right to a speedy and fair trial. At this tribunal, Martin is once again accused of having been elected illegally, and then a new charge is foisted upon him that he was helping and encouraging Olympius. Naturally, Martin said that he was not guilty of either charge, and Constans wasn't having that. The verdict was already decided before the trial was held. And Constans then visited his friend, the dying Patriarch Paul, who had been excommunicated by the Pope some time before. And Constans was bragging about his treatment of the Pope and how the Pope was about to be executed. But the Patriarch had apparently been having nightmares about the afterlife and possibly being sent to hell and tortured for what he was allowing to go down with the Pope. So his dying wish to his old friend Constans was that he would spare the Pope's life and cease making him suffer. And Constans reluctantly granted that dying wish from his old mentor. Only after 85 more days in jail for Martin, though. And then he sent Martin to Cherson in the Crimea, which was a place that was considered desolate and shitty by the Byzantines. So it was kind of a place of punishment. If you had to be exiled somewhere, you'd want to go to one of the islands in the Aegean, where it's sunny and fairly warm. But apparently Constans thought that Martin deserved some punishment, so he sent him to a place that was way colder than anywhere he had ever lived before. And Martin did not really live all that much longer from that point forward. So you might think that after getting rid of Pope Martin that Constans would be satisfied and that he would quit trying to provoke clashes of authority with religious figures who were sometimes more powerful than secular figures. But he did it once again. And this time he chose to go after Maximus the Confessor. Maximus was a learned theologian who had been attached to Byzantine life since at least the time of Heraclius. He'd apparently worked with Heraclius at one point in some capacity or other. Maximus was learned in Neoplatonic philosophy, which was an impressive accomplishment at a time when it was not very widely studied. He also ended up being arrested by Constans and then put on a trial for charges which were not entirely clear. And then he also was sent to Cherson, and if I'm not mistaken, they would have, Maximus and the Pope Martin, that is, would have been at Cherson for some period of time which overlapped, so I guess they could, you know, discuss their woes and their grievances with the emperor in Cherson. So, from the 650s on, Constans had three sons who seemed healthy and destined to achieve adulthood, and those three sons were Constantine, Heraclius, and Tiberius, and he had all three of them associated with him on the throne, meaning that they were established as the heirs to his power rather than his younger brother Theodosius. However, in 660, as his popularity was dipping due to some of the things he was doing, which seemed high-handed, and also his big naval defeat at the hands of Muawiyah, Constans began to fear for his throne and saw his younger brother as a potential threat. So around 660, he forced his younger brother to take holy vows and enter the church, and then in 660 he changed his mind and had Theodosius killed. Now, by doing this is a sign that his unpopularity in the capital was reaching levels that were dangerous to him, and that he was trying to eliminate his biggest and most likely rival. So, this will pretty much conclude the extremely autocratic acts of Constans, or at least it will come close to it. And from here on out, we'll see that most of what he does is fairly rational. Sometime around either 660 or 661, Constans II made his famous decision to go west. Now, this is something that no sitting Byzantine emperor had ever done. If you look at every emperor between Arcadius and Constans II himself, none of them had ever gone to the Western Empire while they were on the throne. And other than Justinian, none of them had really been all that interested in the West. I mean, I guess maybe Heraclius was, and Heraclius had considered relocating the capital temporarily to Carthage and regrouping. But for the most part, the West was very much a secondary consideration for everyone who wasn't named Justinian I. So, Constans II, though, decides to do something radically different than his predecessors. Well, what are his reasons? Primarily, I would say, he knew that the Arabs in North Africa posed a threat to his possessions in Italy and Sicily, and also the Lombards, after an initial successful invasion, were looking a little vulnerable and decentralized. So he was thinking perhaps that he would be able to protect his possessions in Italy and Sicily, and also regain central and northern Italy from the Lombards if they were as weak as he had hoped. The secondary reasons in my mind, but reasons which are primary in the minds of a lot of people, are that Constans was unpopular at home and he wanted to avoid antagonizing the population there further. Also, something that I think is that maybe he was looking at the situation facing him on so many fronts and thinking that Constantinople had the bureaucratic know-how to get the most out of its territories in the east, and he needed to go west to better organize what he had there and get the most out of it. So that way the empire would be operating at peak efficiency and hopefully doing all that it could to fight back against the incursion of the Arabs. But again, it's not really 100% known why he did this, and it's also not known what his intentions were in terms of whether he would stay in the West or just visit. Leading an entire army and fleet all the way over to Sicily and Italy took some preparation, and more or less Constans II spent the entirety of 662 gathering his forces and preparing himself for the journey. So during that year, he was traveling around Greece, and he spent most of his time at the Byzantine enclaves of Thessalonica and Athens. Remember, during this period, most of the Balkans, including most of Greece, was under Slavic occupation. So presumably, during this time, he also did things to help shore up local defenses, and perhaps even laid the groundwork of some of the future themes that would crop up in the Balkans. One of them was headquartered at Thessalonica, so perhaps he was helping to oversee that, and maybe he was trying to do something similar at Athens. It's also possible he was just recruiting locals for his forces and gathering money and supplies. But at any rate, he left in early 663, and he was in Tarentum with his army by the spring of 663, and he was ready to begin campaigning against the Lombards. At first, the Italy campaign was going swimmingly. Constan's force was simply larger, stronger, and better organized than any of the local Lombard forces in South Italy, and he was able to cut a swath all the way to the major center at Benevento, and he began laying siege. Well, not surprisingly, the garrison sent out a call for help to King Grimoald, who was at his capital at Pavia. When the messenger came back, Constans was able to seize the messenger, and he promised that he would not kill the messenger if he reported falsely to the city that the king had told them that they're on their own. But instead of doing that, the messenger revealed that the king was on his way with reinforcements. Constans cut down the messenger, but now the morale of Benevento was restored, and they were able to hold out, and Constans was forced to leave and try something else. And after that, he visited the friendly city at Naples, and he also visited Rome. While at Rome, he received a formal reception from Pope Vitalian, and then he toured all of the city's various churches for about 12 days. This makes him the first emperor to visit Rome since the fall of the West, so that's a fairly big deal. And I'm not sure if there were any other Byzantine emperors after him who visited Italy. I don't know right offhand. Perhaps someone in the comments will say something. I know that some sources claim that Constantine IV visited Sicily a couple times, but again, I think that even those references are a bit questionable. One thing that Constans II did, which papal histories have pointed out and not been too happy about, is that he stripped away some of the remaining valuables from the classical Roman period, like the copper from the roof of the Pantheon, and he supposedly sent those materials back to Constantinople to be melted down and used to fund his war efforts. So in the autumn of 663, after a disappointing time in Italy, Constans II took his army and crossed over to Syracuse, and there he would remain for the next 5 years of his life, which also ended up being the last 5 years of his life. It's really unclear if he actually planned to make Syracuse his capital, or whether he was just doing an impromptu extended tour that he hadn't intended in the first place. It's also not clear whether maybe he wanted to set up an auxiliary capital in Syracuse and use that as a forward operating base against the Arabs in the west. So his plans are a little unclear, and it's probable that a lot of the people who ended up being complicit in his assassination tried to spread the story that he wanted to stay in Syracuse indefinitely and shift the capital, so that way the Greek authority figures would be sympathetic to the fact that they had killed the emperor, since they did not want to be away from their homes for the rest of their lives, and they would have seen Syracuse as an inferior base when compared to Constantinople. Anyway, these same hostile sources say that tax collection under Constans II in Syracuse was brutal, and included enslaving debtors who couldn't make their payments, sometimes forcing them to sell their children into slavery as well, and forcing women into prostitution so that they could raise enough money to pay these taxes off. It's not clear whether this was hyperbole or simply the imposition of a full-on Byzantine tax system to subjects who were far enough away from the center of Byzantine power that they had not been subjected to this in the past, and that maybe they were just reacting very strongly. Or maybe these sources were written by people who just happened to hate Constans II, or even the Byzantines more broadly. At any rate, he was murdered in his bath on September 15th, 668 by one of his Greek attendants, and I guess we don't really know the exact reasons, or if this was even a political killing. Maybe it was a personal thing. I mean, we've seen some evidence that Constans II may not have been the easiest guy to get along with, so it could have just been a disgruntled employee who offed him when he had the chance, or it could have been part of a conspiracy by a usurper who will rise up as soon as Constan's body is cold. So right after the death of Constans, Mezisios will claim the imperial authority in Sicily, and he'll end up reigning for about 7 months there. He's a general who was of Armenian descent, and he was presumably one of the key officers for Constans in the west. At this time, he controlled Syracuse, and during that time, he was able to mint coinage in his own name. And because Constans will be dead by the time that this guy takes power, his usurpation and potential threat to the unity of the empire will be a problem that Constans will pass on to his son, Constantine IV. So what was the legacy of Constans II the Bearded? Well, first off, he must have had the best beard of any emperor, since he is the only emperor to earn the nickname the Bearded. Also, he held the helm during a formative stage in one of Byzantium's greatest crises. This was a time when Byzantium and its very existence was endangered, and he had to adapt to the situation. Now, granted, Heraclius had done quite a few things to try to get the situation stabilized, such as retreating behind the Taurus Mountains and using that as a defense line. But then the game changed in the time of Constans II once Muawiyah started building ships. And he had to make further adjustments to protect his empire. He came up with an interesting strategy of going west and trying to, milk the teat there to a greater extent. However, he wasn't really necessarily the man at the time demanded in the same way that his grandfather Heraclius had been. Heraclius was someone who proved to be a great general, and he was able to use his personal valor and his military skill to ultimately overcome what had been an overwhelming Persian victory. And Constans II does not seem to have had the military skill to do that. Now, maybe it was just that the Byzantine army and navy were outmatched by their Arab foes at this time. But at any rate, he doesn't really have any great victories to his name. And when he died, the empire was in worse condition than when he inherited the throne, due to Muawiyah developing a fleet, capturing Rhodes, and doing other things, especially the overrun of Egypt, which one can't really blame on Constans since he was so young at the time. However, all that aside, all that being relatively negative, the most positive thing that can be said about Constans is something which more than makes up for those other things, and that is that it looks like Constans II was the ruler who oversaw the implementation of the thematic system in its earliest stages, around 660 or so. And this is something we have to say with a bit of caution because the evidence is limited, so it's hard to know with any certainty if Constans II is the guy who made this happen. Certainly we know for a fact that Constantine IV set up at least a couple of themes, but maybe the system itself was an invention of Constans. And if that's true and Constans II is the person who invented the system, then this makes him one of the greatest reformers in Byzantine history, since the thematic system is what will eventually enable the Byzantines to survive this extended crisis during the 7th century and ultimately go on to reclaim its power in the next couple centuries after that. So while Constans did not have the most successful reign, he did set up his successors for great success and prolonged survival. So I think in that regard he is one of the most important emperors that Byzantium ever had, and someone who gets unfairly overlooked because despite his own many eccentricities, he was simply outshone by his grandfather and by his own grandson as well. Today I'd like to take a look at the life and times of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IV, who ruled between 668 and 685. Constantine had the misfortune of coming between better-known emperors from his own family and of being smack dab in the 7th century, which was part of the Byzantine Dark Age, a time in which we don't really know as much as we'd like. However, we do know enough about Constantine IV to know that he was one of the most important emperors of that time, and that he achieved some fairly substantial things which were vital to the development and survival of the Byzantine world. So, without any further ado, let's look into the career of Constantine IV. Constantine IV was born in 652, and he was named co-emperor to his father Constans II in 654. One interesting thing about their relationship is that due to the paucity of information about the century in general, there was initially some confusion as to which one of them was the bearded. And for a while, some scholars were identifying Constantine IV as the bearded, when in reality it was his father Constans II who earned that nickname. Constantine had two younger brothers, Heraclius and Tiberius, and both of them were also accorded crowns while Constans II was still alive and kicking. Constantine IV, however, would be the son who inherited the throne when his father was murdered in Sicily in 668. Young Constantine IV was only 15 years old at the time of his accession. So, just like all the Heraclean emperors, Constantine IV had to face a crisis immediately upon his accession to the throne. Early in 669, the troops in Asia Minor marched on the capital, and they demanded that Constantine share power with his two younger brothers, on the grounds that it would be like the Trinity in heaven. Most likely, what they were trying to do is a divide and conquer strategy against the young imperial princes, trying to empower the army at the expense of the Heraclean dynasty. Constantine IV, like any Heraclean, was a natural-born autocrat, and he saw through this plot immediately. So when he met with these leaders, instead of talking with them and empowering his two younger brothers, he simply had all of these leaders executed as mutineers, which dealt with the problem pretty neatly. This incident shows Constantine's autocratic streak, which was every bit as strong as that of his father Constans II and that of his son Justinian II. And in addition, what this shows is that there was public support in one way or another for all members of the Heraclean dynasty. This dynasty had achieved legitimacy in a way that was not usual in the Byzantine world. At the same time that young Constantine was dealing with the army of Asia Minor at home, he received news that there was a usurper in Sicily. So, when Constans II was assassinated, one of his generals named Mazizius, who may or may not have been involved in the death of Constans II, declared himself emperor and managed to take control in Syracuse. He ruled there for 7 months, and he did have enough power to mint his own coin, but beyond that, it doesn't look like he was able to really seize control of the entire Byzantine West. Our sources are also divided on how the imperial forces managed to defeat Mazizius. Michael de Syrian says that Constantine IV arrived in person and fought Mazizius, but papal sources say that local forces dealt with Mazizius. If I had to guess, I would say that the papal sources were correct, simply because Constantine IV now was suspicious of his brothers after the whole Asia Minor incident, and he had bigger fish to fry than dealing with a minor usurper who wasn't even able to get the entirety of the West to back him. So it's very likely that most of the forces in the West remained loyal and managed to restore Heraclean control in the name of the absent Constantine IV. And now Constantine IV had to confront his biggest enemy, Caliph Muawiyah of the Umayyad Caliphate. Muawiyah was still Byzantium's most determined foe, and his forces were now pressing the Byzantine frontiers harder than they had in the past. In 668, the Byzantine general Saborius had revolted, probably against Constans, and he had invited Muawiyah to help him revolt. It looks like news of Constantine's accession reached him a little bit later, but once you're in revolt, you kind of have to keep going, because then you're a traitor. So if you want to stop being a traitor, you either have to die or win. So Saborius had already cast the die there. Anyway, Saborius ended up dying in a horse accident early on, but Muawiyah decided to press his advantage and try to eliminate the empire, something that he had been trying to do since his appointment as governor of Syria all the way back in 639. Muawiyah recognized that the Byzantine Empire was not as strong as it had been, and that it had fewer resources with which to respond to any potential threats. So he decided to attack on several fronts and hope that the Byzantines collapsed on at least one of them. His ultimate goal, however, was to capture Constantinople, which he recognized as the key to the survival of the Byzantine Empire. So he entrusted the main mission to his son Yazid, and he dispatched him deep into Anatolia, and he also dispatched another army to attack North Africa at the same time. North Africa, if you'll recall, had briefly fallen into Arab hands before this, and then the Byzantines managed to reclaim it. Now, Muawiyah wants it back. So Yazid was able to penetrate all the way to Chalcedon, the city just across the straits from Constantinople itself, and he was also able to temporarily capture Amorium. In other words, Yazid and his forces were in a good position to set up shop along the coast and receive naval aid near Constantinople, which would ultimately enable them to besiege the city. Now, while this is going on the eastern front, in North Africa in 670, the Umayyads were able to overrun all of North Africa with the exception of Carthage itself, and now they have enough ports in North Africa to begin raiding into Byzantine Sicily, the former imperial seat of Constans II. And Muawiyah, to his credit, was able to keep his eye on the prize, and now that he has some footholds in the heart of Byzantine territory near the capital, he is going to divert all of his efforts, or at least his main efforts, to the project of putting himself in a position to besiege Constantinople. With all of that in mind, Arab forces worked systematically to gain bases near Constantinople and provide themselves with the logistical infrastructure to sustain a large army and navy to besiege the capital of the Byzantine Empire. In 670, the Arabs were able to capture Cyzicus, and then they captured the city of Smyrna in 672. The first Arab naval attack on Constantinople occurred in 672, and that distracted Constantine IV to the degree that the Slavs were actually able to organize and lay siege to Thessalonica, a siege which went on for several years and effectively made the second city of the empire completely useless when it came to defending the capital against the Arabs. So, now that the Arabs had all of their local bases in place, they felt able to go for a long-term, large-scale siege of the city, and they began their siege in 674. Presumably during this 4 or so year period when they could see what was going on, the Byzantines spent their time strengthening their fortifications and building more ships to strengthen their navy to try to resist this coming siege. The Arab siege of Constantinople lasted from 674 to 678, and I don't think there's any real doubt that this was one of the key turning points in Byzantine history. So, going into the siege, Byzantium had been constantly on the decline since the Arab invasions had started. And now, for the first time, they're going to win a major victory and then begin the slow process of recovering some of their lost power. So this siege had an intermittent nature. What would happen is that the Arab ships would arrive in the spring, lay siege, fail for the year, and then go home for winter and come back and do it all over again. It was fairly clear, at least it seems like it was clear to the attackers, that they were not going to be able to take the city as early as 674, but they continued to try anyway. The Arabs were unable to penetrate Constantinople's defenses, and they also did not succeed in starving the city out. The details of this campaign are actually fairly scanty, except for one very well-known detail that we'll talk about in greater depth momentarily. What ends up happening in the end is that the demoralized Arabs left for Syria in 678 and took their fleet with them. Unfortunately for the sailors present, they happened upon a storm while they were rounding a cape, and the vast majority of their ships were lost. At the same time, there was a near simultaneous land battle in Lycia, which also resulted in a Byzantine victory, and that was the first major Byzantine battlefield victory against the Arabs. So, between those two events, Constantine IV is now a hero, and Byzantium's spirits and morale are also rising. So, what started out as a dark chapter where the very existence of the empire was in question turned into a time when the empire would begin this long road to recovery. Although the details of the campaign are scanty, we do know that the siege of Constantinople from 674 to 678 was the first ever use of the fully mature version of Greek fire, and that this weapon was something that the Arabs simply could not counter. Now, there are precursors for Greek fire which date back as early as the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BCE, But this time, this Greek fire will be in its fully mature form, and it seems to have been fired from cannons on board Byzantine ships. And because of the danger that Greek fire posed to wooden ships, it's no wonder that the Arab fleet was ineffective against the fortifications of Constantinople over this 4-year period. You can imagine how frustrating this must have been if you were one of the Arab commanders and you couldn't risk a naval battle for fear of having your entire fleet go up in flames. So let's tie up some loose ends. Back in Sicily, after Mazizius had been defeated in 669, his son John had remained in Sicily and was presumably content to live as a civilian. However, most likely due to the pressures of renewed Arab attacks in the region, John decided to revolt in his own name in 678 and take up the mantle of his father. Michael the Syrian claims that the revolt also lasted for 7 months, just like Mazizius' revolt had, and then Constantine IV arrived in person and dealt with it. However, given that Constantine IV was actually dealing with the siege of Constantinople, which was a literal life and death struggle for his empire, it's extraordinarily unlikely that he was able to find the time to go to Sicily and deal with John. But it looks like Michael the Syrian was someone who assumed that emperors had to be present at all times for anything to happen, which is not true, but an interesting assumption nonetheless. After the pair of Byzantine victories in 678, Caliph Muawiyah, who was now elderly, decided that it was best to let well enough alone and end the war with the Byzantines. At home, the Umayyads also had to deal with Christian rebels from the Taurus Mountains called the Mardites, who were now raiding into Syria and Palestine and creating some havoc. So Muawiyah wanted to make peace with the Byzantines and focus on the more pressing problem near to his capital at Damascus. When he agreed to peace in 679, surprisingly, Muawiyah agreed to pay tribute to the Byzantines of 50 slaves, 50 horses, and 3,000 pounds of gold, and he also gave them back some of the islands that he had conquered during the time of Constans II and Constantine IV. And while you might think that this represents a major shift in power, it actually was not all that unusual for a stronger power to pay tribute to a weaker power during this period. After all, if you'll recall, the Byzantines sometimes paid tribute to the Sasanian Persians, even though the Byzantines were almost always stronger than their Persian neighbors. So don't make too much of the fact that Muawiyah was willing to pay them money. Like any good Byzantine ruler, as soon as the ink was dry on his peace agreement with Muawiyah, Constantine IV pitched himself wholeheartedly into ecclesiastical affairs. And this took the form of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which was called between November 680 and September 681, to settle the issue of monothelitism once and for all. What ends up happening over the next 10 months is that the council upholds the Council of Chalcedon from 451, and they ended the monothelite controversy. One thing that really facilitated this was, ironically, that most of the people who would consider themselves to be monothelites were now living under the Umayyads, and therefore they didn't really matter too much for decisions that would only affect imperial subjects. By resolving the monothelite controversy, Constantine IV thereby actually fulfilled an ambition of Heraclius and Heraclius's heroic patriarch Sergius, who had defended the city against a Persian siege back during the Byzantine-Sasanian War. By 680 or 681, Constantine IV was at the pinnacle of his popularity. He had been the first Byzantine ruler to preside over battlefield victories against the Arabs, who up to that point had looked basically invincible. He had resolved a major ecclesiastical dispute, or at least was in the process of resolving it. And the greatest foe of the empire, Caliph Muawiyah, died in 680. So it looked like the future was bright for Constantine, who was still young, and his dynasty. Around this time, Constantine IV was hailed as the light of the world, the new Constantine the Great, the new Marcian, the new Justinian, and the destroyer of heretics. And everything was looking peachy keen, and then he decided to launch a battlefield campaign against the Bulgars in the Balkans, now that he had the latitude to operate in the west and didn't have to worry about another Arab fleet trying to take his capital. And let's see how that goes. In 680, the Bulgars crossed the Danube and began to subjugate local communities. And for Constantine IV, this posed an obvious danger since it was clear that the Bulgars were forming an empire. Now, if you look at the state of the Balkans otherwise, the Slavs had overrun most of Byzantium's territory, but for the most part, they hadn't really formed states, at least not states that could pose any kind of danger to Byzantine survival. So this is a new crisis, and Constantine IV is eager to deal with it early. So in 680, he led out his army to the Danube basin and began to lay siege to the city of Dobruja. However, it looks like the Byzantines didn't do a very good job of reconnoitering the area, and they didn't really know where all of the Bulgar armies were. And to compound things, Constantine fell ill about this time, perhaps of gout or maybe some other disease, and he left his army in the hands of his generals and returned to the capital. And then in early 681, the Bulgar forces consolidated at Dobruja and inflicted a massive defeat on the Byzantine army, which was more or less completely defeated. And the defeat was severe enough that Constantine IV was forced to acknowledge Bulgarian control of the former province of Mysia. The significance of that is that while many Byzantine territories had been overrun, it was rare for them to officially recognize that those territories were lost and then grant a foreign power official recognized control of that area. So this was a huge setback for Constantine IV, and it had to be a pretty big disappointment coming on the heels of so many great successes, and it really had to dampen that spirit of making a great comeback that they had at this time. Despite the massive defeat that he had suffered at the hands of the Bulgars, it appears that Constantine IV's personal prestige was not really all that badly affected, and that he still had quite a bit of goodwill with the public. Now, up until 681, his younger brothers Tiberius and Heraclius were technically co-emperors, although they didn't really exercise anything like imperial authority. So in 681, Constantine took the opportunity to have his brothers removed from power and to secure the succession of his young son Justinian II. So he took his brothers, had them removed from office, and then had them mutilated by having their noses slit. And the thought at the time was that if your nose was slit, you would then be ineligible to hold office. This is something that was an innovation in the Heraclian period. And in 681, now that his brothers were gone, Constantine therefore elevated his son Justinian II to the status of co-emperor. So now the line of succession was secured. And the irony, of course, of making his brothers ineligible by slitting their noses is that a similar fate would befall his own son Justinian II, and he would simply ignore that custom and return to power. Unfortunately, we don't know very much about Constantine's last 4 years aside from his actions in securing the line of succession for his son Justinian. We can guess that he was in terrible health, though, and that he didn't do very much. He did suffer a heavy defeat at the hands of the Bulgars, as we already discussed, but that doesn't seem to have badly undermined his popularity. At least, so far as we can tell. Again, the evidence is pretty limited. If this mosaic on the screen is to be believed, then despite the fact that Constantine was only in his early 30s, his health was already completely gone, and he was a walking corpse. He died in September of 685 of dysentery, at least that's the official explanation. To me, if you just look at that mosaic, it looks a little more like cancer or something like that. And he was only 33 years old. He had reigned for about 17 years, and he had accomplished quite a bit. Had he been in better health and lived longer, who knows what he might have gone on to accomplish. So what is the legacy of Emperor Constantine IV? Well, on an institutional level, he continued to develop the thematic system. I don't remember which theme it was, but there is at least one theme that he personally founded. He also managed to restore religious unity to a reduced empire. While that would not be as great of a deed as restoring unity to a larger empire, still, It's an accomplishment, especially when you look at the history of Byzantine religion and how difficult it was to get all parties to reconcile around a shared belief. He's also, most significantly, the first emperor to preside over meaningful victories against the Arabs. So he proves that the Arabs can be beaten. And that's something that will really restore the morale of his empire and help them to put themselves on the road to recovery and rebuilding the empire. Unfortunately for Constantine IV, he is overshadowed by his great-grandfather Heraclius and by his son Justinian II, who were larger personalities, lived longer, reigned longer, and got themselves involved in more shenanigans. But Constantine IV was vital to Byzantine survival in the 7th century in his own right, and if we're talking about how the Byzantines came through this great crisis that was posed by the Arab invasions, no discussion of their survival is complete without at least some mention of Constantine IV and his accomplishments. Hello everybody, Thersites the Historian here, and I would like to talk about Justinian II Rhinotmetus, an emperor of Byzantium who ruled from 685 to 695, and again from 705 to 715. He is a controversial figure, mainly because he was once disfigured in a way which made him ineligible to serve as emperor by the standards of his day, and yet he strove to come back, and he successfully did rule once again for another 10 years. Now, there's a lot of mythology surrounding Justinian II, and I would like to talk about some of that, and also look at his time in a more general sense to kind of contextualize him and his life. So without too much further ado, let's dig right in. One of the reasons why I wanted to do a project on Justinian II is because I was really interested in busting some of the myths and misconceptions that someone who has only read about him online would most likely have, given the absolute poverty of thought that goes into typical treatments of Justinian. Here's one from Badasses of History. I'll read you the opening paragraph of their take on Justinian. Emperor Justinian II of Byzantium wasn't a brilliant military strategist, a capable ruler, a benevolent dictator, or even a fucking half-decent human being. He was a ruthless, merciless motherfucker who crushed all who opposed him, brutally eliminated his enemies, and let nothing stand in the way of his insane, over-the-top, possibly misguided mission to stomp the lower intestines of anybody ballsy enough to think they could screw him over for any reason. His entire existence was dedicated to one incredibly badass mission: live for revenge. Well, that sounds great, but unfortunately it's mostly bullshit. Sure, Justinian was a ruthless guy. However, he lived in the 7th and 8th centuries, when pretty much everyone fit that description. This is not unusual for a man of his time period. So if we're going to say something like what they're saying here, we'd have to assume that what Justinian did was in some way atypical or bizarre, and that is simply not the case. There are other sources which pretend to be more serious and more high-minded than Badasses of History, which at least can be forgiven since it's clearly just for entertainment, such as the YouTube channel The Real Crusades History, or whatever they call themselves, who accept the notion that Justinian was a deranged madman, and they are only really interested in glorifying the Catholic Church and really trying to cast aspersions against Islam in the Middle Ages. But that's neither here nor there. I'm sure at some point in the future we'll have recourse into, refute some of their stuff directly. But anyway, until then, let's just move on and talk about Justinian II and the myths surrounding his reign. Before we really dig into Justinian's life, I think it's important to take a moment to sort of talk about the sources that we're actually using in order to learn about Justinian and his times. The two major sources on Justinian are Nicephorus the Patriarch and Theophanes, who wrote a work called the Chronicle. Now, both of these works were written anywhere from about half a century to a full century after Justinian's time, and both of them paint a pretty negative portrayal of Justinian, especially Theophanes. There also are more contemporary Italian and Arab sources which mention his activities as emperor as it pertained to their own affairs. The main scholar whose work I'm following in this video is Constance Head, who wrote the book Justinian II of Byzantium in 1972. And in that book, she was basically writing a revisionist account of Justinian and his life, where she makes the claim that this negative tradition that we see in Nicephorus and Theophanes, but not in the foreign sources and not, say, in the church records, because at one point Justinian II was celebrated as a saint with a feast day that didn't last forever. It was discontinued because of his negative historiographical reputation. Anyway, she makes what I find to be a compelling argument about the sources, and I also think that she does a very good job of proving that Justinian II was not a madman, even if he fell short of being, Plato's ideal philosopher prince. So those are sort of the things I'm drawing on and the argument that I'm going to be advancing in this video. Justinian II was born into the Heraclean dynasty, and he was destined to become the first fifth-generation ruler in Roman history. Now, I say Roman because the Byzantines self-identified as Roman, and even though they spoke Greek by Justinian's time, the 7th and 8th centuries, they referred to themselves as the Romans. So they called themselves the Hoi Romanoi, if you want to hear the Greek. His father was named Constantine IV, and his coin is pictured on your screen. Constantine IV was an avid admirer of the 6th century emperor Justinian I, and because of that he named his eldest child Justinian after that famous ruler. Justinian I, of course, is the ruler who built the Hagia Sophia and also reestablished Byzantine control of North Africa and Italy. Now, Justinian as a child had a younger brother named Heraclius. However, so far as we can tell, Heraclius must have died in childhood, which was a fairly common thing in antiquity and the Middle Ages. He had two uncles who were very close in age to him, and that he would have grown up with them. They were only a few years older, but when he was about 12 in the year 681, his father Constantine IV decided to have the two uncles mutilated and had them exiled. Now we'll talk about the method of mutilation chosen, since it is one which Justinian II himself would later experience. Now, Constantine IV died at the age of 33 in the year 685 when Justinian II was only 16. And that might sound worse than it actually is, but in this world you were considered a full-grown and fully competent man at the age of 15. So Justinian II was fully qualified, and with his younger brother dead and his uncles removed from the succession and considered to be ineligible for office due to their physical imperfections, Justinian had a clear path to power, and as we'll see, he was actually quite obviously fit for that power. The most important event of Justinian's youth and the crowning achievement of his father Constantine IV was the repulsion of the Arab invasion and siege of Constantinople. This siege lasted for 5 years and was ultimately repulsed by the invention of Greek fire, which helped to destroy the Arab fleet and enabled Constantinople to hold out. Any proper understanding of Justinian II has to take into account the state of the Byzantine Empire in the year 685 when he came to power. So let's look at the world around him and what was going on. So from 632 onward, the Arabs had been invading Byzantine territory, and that had been a struggle that all the Heraclean emperors had faced. Heraclius I was still in power when the initial Arab invasions happened. and he grew old and sickly trying to fight the Arab invasions in his last years. Constantine IV, as we've already discussed, the fourth generation Heraclean ruler, repulsed a direct attack on Constantinople. During this time, as you can see on the map, North Africa had not completely fallen to the Arabs yet, and that wouldn't happen until during the time of Justinian, actually. Now, one thing that's not quite as clear on this map is that there are Bulgars all across the Balkans. Bulgars, of course, being the ancestors of the present-day Bulgarians. They were politically divided in ways that are somewhat confusing. There are the Bulgars north of the Danube who are depicted on the map. There are also the Avars around. And then there were Bulgars and these people called Slovenians in the Balkans at the same time. It's not really clear how much of the Balkans the Byzantines directly controlled at any given time during the 7th and 8th centuries, but it is sufficient to note that imperial control was far from 100%, and we can suspect that it was pretty hard to recruit men or raise taxes in that area. Because of the actions of Justinian I in the 6th century, the Byzantines still held significant territory in Sicily and Italy. And in fact, Justinian II's grandfather had actually tried to relocate the capital of the empire to Syracuse. However, when he died and Constantine IV took power, Constantine decided to remain in Constantinople since that was clearly the power center of the empire. There also is the theme system where military districts are set up and you have a governor in charge of both the civil and military administration, and they command the local province in order to raise armies to defend it. That is a system set up by the Heracleans and which would last for centuries more. There's some debate as to whether or not Justinian improved upon the system. It looks like he may have, but the evidence is a bit ambiguous on that count. By this point, though, two of the most important parts of the old Byzantine Empire were lost, namely Syria and Egypt, which some people think may have accounted for somewhere in the neighborhood of 2/3 or 3/4 of the wealth of the empire in the time of someone like Justinian I. Now, the most important battleground and frontier is in Asia Minor. That's where the Byzantines encountered the Umayyad Caliphate, and it's also, as you can see on the map, their heartland at this point. This is where the majority of the recruits for their army are coming from, and this is the vital area, not, for reasons we've already discussed, the Balkans, or Greece itself. In the interest of clarity, I would like to look at his two reigns separately and also divide the aspects of each reign into thematic categories to keep things as clear as humanly possible. So I would first like to look at politics and war making during Justinian's first reign, which ran from 685 to 695 CE. The first major war that Justinian orchestrated was an all-across-the-board offensive in 688-689, which saw Byzantine armies on the attack in Armenia, Syria, and North Africa. This was an overwhelming success, and it resulted not only in territorial gains, but in the Caliph sending tribute to Constantinople, and it was a fairly heavy tribute. He also then launched a successful campaign in the Balkans against the Slovenians, and despite what Theophanes says, he clearly won the war. We can see that not only because he's able to settle a lot of Slovenians in Asia Minor, forcing them to leave the Balkans where they're causing problems, and settling them where they can be a military colony, but we also see that he made a lot of war booty and took a lot of captives in the war, so it's pretty clear that he won. He also, because of his successes, was greatly honored by the city of Thessalonica, and we found some inscriptions and other evidence which shows that he was extremely popular there, even if he didn't really have a great legacy elsewhere. But of course, Constantinople was the capital, and public opinion there is what went into the sources, not in a provincial city like Thessalonica. He also, when he signed a treaty with the Arabs, agreed to relocate a people called the Mardites to the Balkans. And the sources, they claim that he moved the entire people and that left the frontier defenseless against the Arabs. However, that's not true. We find references in the sources to the Mardites still harassing the Arabs. At least we find that in Arab sources, and we still find it about a century later, so clearly Justinian did not move all of the Mardites. Now, why was he moving so many people around his empire? Well, it's actually an age-old trick. This is something that many rulers across time have done. If you remember Nebuchadnezzar and the Jewish exile, the reason is he wanted to divide a people group to prevent them from having enough unity to revolt. If you take Sclavenians out of the Balkans and settle them in the east, then they're going to be more loyal to their paymaster than to someone else, and then they will serve loyally in your military. At least that's the hope. It ended up not working out that well, as we'll see. Now, we're not really clear what caused the treaty between Justinian and the Caliph to break down, but in the sources, which again are hostile and portray Justinian as a foaming at the mouth crazy person, they say that it was because he was angry at them for minting their own coins for the first time, and that he was really angered that they were putting Islamic art on the papyrus that they were exporting out of Egypt. Now, it does look like they were using these things as provocations, and these sound like pretty stupid pretexts to us, but people in this period took religion very seriously, so even if it makes literally no logical sense at all, this is something which to them was a matter of great importance. So, the Arab-Byzantine War broke out in 692, and it's pretty clear that the Arabs were the aggressors in this conflict. Justinian didn't really lose a ton of territory during this war, but he did suffer some humiliating battlefield defeats, and some of those came because a portion of the Sclavenians who he settled in in Asia Minor actually defected in battle and joined the Arabs. There was a general in charge of them called Leontius who was imprisoned for this, and we'll come back to him later since he becomes an important figure in Justinian's life for other reasons. One other thing that Justinian did during his first reign is he engaged in an ambitious building project. Now, there are no surviving examples of Justinian II's buildings, probably because they either weren't finished or because his successors took credit for them. But anyway, that's an obvious instance of him really trying to imitate Justinian I, who is best known as a builder in addition to being a conqueror. But the real lasting legacy of, say, Justinian I is the Hagia Sophia. Justinian II tried and failed to copy that, and a lot of it is because he presided over an empire which, as we noted earlier, is significantly less wealthy than the Byzantine Empire of the 6th century. Ever since Constantine the Great back in the 4th century, one of the major expectations that people had for emperors in the East is that they would preside over the church and ensure orthodoxy, as well as defend the faith. Now, Justinian II himself was always in accordance with the Orthodox faith, and as we'll see, he attempted to add to the teachings and practices of the church. Some of his predecessors were actually heretics, but Justinian II at no point could be considered a heretic, which no doubt helped him achieve saint status, even if that was short-lived. His famous religious contribution was called the Quinisext Council, which means the 5th, 6th Council. This is actually a tribute to Justinian I and to his father Constantine IV, because each one of them presided over a council. The 5th Council was the Council of Justinian, and the 6th Council was the Council of Constantine IV. Both of those councils were about theology. However, Justinian II was content with the theological findings of his father. He was more interested in conduct. So what he was looking for was a reformation of morals that would affect both clergy and lay people, and he ended up passing 102 different canons on behavior. Now, this caused a ton of controversy, and it also caused a lot of disputes with the West. The problem with these canons is that because they were passed in the East, they reflect Eastern practices and standards. Remember, the East spoke Greek and had been able to maintain a higher standard of living for the most part, especially in Constantinople, than had been the case in the West. And because a lot of these priests and bishops were relatively independent, they could kind of develop their own local traditions. And there were obviously going to be some differences between a church which mostly spoke Greek and its other half which mostly spoke Latin. Certain differences would also emerge from local geography, and you can imagine how this would happen over the course of a couple centuries. Now, because a lot of Western practices are explicitly condemned as barbaric and kind of mocked, the Pope clearly took exception to this and was not happy. And even during his second reign, when Justinian was fortunate enough to have a Pope of Syrian extraction in office, who was a lot more favorable to Eastern standards, this was something that was really a matter of controversy and something which was never quite successful. His main target for these canons was the what he saw as pagan survivals, so customs which harkened back to old Greek religious festivals, which might mention or seem to allude to gods like Dionysus or Artemis or Athena. Now, chances are a lot of these practices would be things which had kind of just become cultural and no longer had much of a religious significance. However, like many Byzantine emperors, Justinian II was an adamant, hardcore, no-nonsense Christian who was absolutely dedicated to eradicating anything out of keeping with what he saw as the one true faith. The problem for the people living in Constantinople, and later for Justinian, is that the things that he went after were things that they liked. A lot of popular activities, such as playing dice, dancing, and acting, came under fire and were forbidden for both clergy and laity alike. And we can only imagine that this must have made him deeply unpopular with the people, even if it apparently did endear him to the church. So later on, he clearly has popularity issues in the city, and this seems to be the most likely cause. He was the Quaker in their group. He's the guy who's trying to take all the fun away. So this may be something which cost him public popularity, and something which ultimately contributed to his downfall both the first and the second time. Aside from being the emperor with the slit nose who came back despite the social stigma he bore, Justinian II is probably best known for his coins. And the major innovation of his first reign, which he brought back during his second reign, is the introduction for the first time of Jesus on his coins, on the obverse or front. And then he portrayed himself holding a cross on the back, as you see here. These are the two sides of the same coin. Now, this image that he has of Christ with the long hair, this becomes sort of the standard image of Christ that we see a lot in Christian iconography and on future coins which feature Christ. Now, to circle back to that whole thing about the coinage and papyrus dispute that led to the 692 Arab-Byzantine War, I think Constance Head made a really good point when she said that the inclusion of Christ on these coins is probably what made the Caliph want to start minting coins rather than circulating Christian propaganda on coins. And this might also have been the reason why the Arabs started putting Islamic symbology on the papyrus that they exported to Constantinople, that maybe it was a religious propaganda war. That's certainly what it seems like, and I think that her argument there is pretty solid. So anyway, this is what Justinian did, and after him, we see that this image of Christ becomes standard. During his second reign, he actually tried a different look for Jesus, what is called the Syrian look, which has shorter hair, but that didn't catch on, and it was actually the design from his first reign which became standard. In 695, Justinian II was deposed and mutilated. And the question then becomes, why? What motive did people have for overthrowing him? Well, the primary motive seems to have been that Justinian II was a champion of small farmers over large landowners, that he pushed for their rights over the rights of large landowners to impose upon them or to rule like local aristocrats. Now, I'm a little fuzzy on the details of how that would have worked. I am an ancient historian, not a medieval historian or a Byzantinist, so I can't really say much more than that. However, we also know from some of the sources that Justinian II apparently had two very famous and deeply unpopular tax collectors who liked to employ harsh methods such as imprisonment and torture in order to ensure payments that were on time and in full. And the primary victims of these two taxmen were the rich, because they're the ones who had the money. Now, if we circle back to the Arab-Byzantine War of 692, the general in charge of the Sclavenians was this guy named Leontius, who was a landowning patrician. And for his failure, he was imprisoned for about 2 or 3 years. And then Justinian in 695 decided to set Leontius free with a pardon, and also he gave him a commission to take up a new army. Well, Leontius was still kind of pissed off, and he was approached by the other landowners, and they joined in league and overthrew Justinian, and Leontius declared himself to be emperor. Now, because Leontius was an old friend of Constantine IV, he decided to take the merciful course, the Christian course, and he chose to inflict rhinocopia on Justinian and then exile him. Now, rhinocopia is where a nose is slit. I'm not entirely clear on how the practice would have been employed, but in this illustration, it looks like his nostrils were basically trimmed back to the point where he was given a unattractive but not unserviceable nose. This seems to have been something which would have been disfiguring without necessarily, crippling or making a, really lowering a person's quality of life to a major degree. But the custom back then for the Byzantines was that an emperor could not bear any major physical faults. This is something which actually goes back to the Romans and which almost prevented Claudius in the 1st century from holding power, the guy who had a bit of a limp and a drool. So this was seen as something which would effectively prevent Justinian from reclaiming power, and the idea is now he can go live out his days in exile. But as you already know, it didn't quite work out like that. After being mutilated and deposed, Justinian was sent to Cherson, which is a city in the southern Crimea, and he remained there for about 9 years from 695 to 704. During his time there, he made friends with a local abbot, and this person was almost certainly responsible for reporting to the imperial government about Justinian's activities, and we can only imagine that he probably gave a fairly favorable portrayal of what Justinian was saying and doing, and most likely he downplayed all of Justinian's talk about coming back and getting revenge. Eventually word got out, though, about Justinian's intentions, and before imperial authorities could crack down, Justinian fled to the Khazars, and he promised an alliance if he were to be restored to power. And in pursuance of that strategy, he married a Khazar princess who was the sister of the current Khazar ruler, and he declared her the Empress Theodora. Now, later on, this Khazar ruler would get cold feet and decide that Justinian wasn't going to win, but Justinian did not give up, and he eventually kept building his supporter base and was determined to come back, despite the fact that no one really believed in him and that he had been betrayed by his brother-in-law. Let's take a look at what was going on back at Constantinople while Justinian II was occupied in the Crimea. So Leontius, the man who overthrew him and mutilated his nose, was only in power for 3 years, and he had the misfortune of presiding over the fall of Carthage in 697. Now, Leontius never really left Constantinople, but he did dispatch a big fleet to try to retake the city in 698, and that really force failed miserably. Since they were dealing with an emperor who had once been a general, they figured that he wouldn't take kindly to incompetence, so they found a German guy named Apsamar, and they declared him emperor and decided to take the throne to avoid punishment. Now, Apsamar took the name Tiberius and overthrew Leontius, ironically inflicting rhinocopia upon him and making him a monk right there in Constantinople. And Tiberius reigned for about 7 or 8 years? I don't know. I'm not good at math. You do the math for yourself. I'm a historian, not a mathematician. 7 years. Now, Tiberius is kind of forgotten because he was a usurper and he never left any dynasty, but he actually had real foreign policy success. He won several major victories against the Arabs. However, as we already know, he was overthrown by the ex-emperor Justinian II. And now for the series of events which made Justinian II a true legend. So, we've already discussed all of the setbacks he had and the betrayal at the hand of the Khazars, but Justinian II was not deterred, and he was going to press on to victory or find his death somewhere on the battlefield. At one point, he's sailing around with his small band of compatriots trying to gather funds and allies, and a horrible storm blew up, and one of his sailors asked him to pray to God to save them in exchange for Justinian pardoning all of his enemies and not seeking vengeance. Justinian responded that if he so much as truly considered pardoning any of his enemies, that he wished that God would strike him down right then and there. And that is probably an apocryphal story spread by the people like Theophanes who are trying to paint a dramatic portrait of this crazed lunatic. However, it does show the level of determination that Justinian had to succeed against virtually impossible odds. Now, when he got to Constantinople, the main allies he'd been able to find were the Bulgars north of the Danube under the ruler Tervel, who was really important for setting up the Bulgar state. Now, when he got there, because most of his army was foreign and because Tiberius was actually not hated, the citizens wouldn't open up the gates. Now, maybe if Justinian hadn't been so anti-fun, a few citizens might have been willing to bring him back. After all, people back then tended to be relatively loyal to dynasties such as the Heraclians, who had ruled for a long time and accomplished great things. But apparently Justinian II didn't have that aura. Or possibly the social custom of rhinocopia still held a kind of influence which prevented them from thinking that he was worthy of holding the throne anymore. Anyway, it became an academic issue, though, because Justinian and his men managed to locate a hidden gate, and he took his hardcore following in with the Bulgars outside, and he managed to take the palace, and he overthrew Tiberius. When he eventually captured Tiberius, who had fled, he brought Tiberius and Leontius to the Hippodrome, and he used the two of them as footstools while the races went on. At the conclusion of the events, he had both men, who had the same nose problem that he did, executed in front of the public, while they chanted a psalm about disobeying your master and the punishment that you get. Now, during this time, Justinian had taken to wearing the golden nose to disguise his disfigurement, although just like Donald Trump's love of things golden, it doesn't really cover anything up, and it really just draws attention to your own shortcomings, but Justinian II thought that it was mega classy to have a golden nose. So what are you going to do? During this period, he went after all of the relatives and key supporters of both usurpers, and since these men had ruled for 10 years between them, this meant that a great number of senior generals were executed, and this will probably lead to a lot of the military failures that take place in Justinian's second reign. When Tiberius, his young infant son, and his wife Theodora arrived in 706, Justinian crowned Tiberius as his co-emperor, and that was to set up the line of succession, and apparently to, then give the Heraclean line a sixth generation. However, as we'll see, Tiberius never grew up and never got to rule anything. During his first reign, Justinian was pretty successful on the battlefield, but during his second reign, it was almost all defeat and disaster. In 708, he tried to repeat his Sclavonian campaign from his first reign by marching into the Balkans, but he was soundly defeated by the Bulgars in 708 and barely escaped with his life and freedom. Presumably, these were not the Bulgars of Tervel, since Tervel was still an ally 3 years later. But there were, as I said earlier, many different groups of Bulgars, and the Bulgars who defeated them were most likely the ones who had invaded the Balkans. Now, from 709 onward, he's also under constant attack from the Arabs in Asia Minor, and he loses some key outposts and cities. And these defeats really help undermine his credibility once again. The sources say that the effectiveness of his army was really held back by the number of inexperienced troops and commanders that were present. The inexperienced troops, we're not sure why there would be inexperienced troops as opposed to some other time. But as for commanders, we just talked about how during his quest for revenge, he killed many of the senior commanders of the empire, and that is going to come with a price, and the price is battlefield defeat. We do know that he mounted an expedition to Ravenna in order to punish these insubordinate nobles there. That expedition actually did work, and they brought back some disloyal subjects and had them executed in Constantinople. Now later on, there was a revolt in the Crimea, where one of the armies he had stationed up there revolted and went over to the Khazars. So he sent a second expedition to deal with the problem, and they failed. So by this point, Justinian II was known as a fairly merciless guy, and just like that expedition which Leontius had sent out to Carthage, they're thinking that they really don't want to go home and face the consequences of failure. In the sources, the whole Crimean campaign is said to have been motivated by Justinian's desire for revenge on either the people of Cherson who turned him out or the Khazars who betrayed him. But because he waited until so late in his second reign, and it had been, several years by that point, that doesn't really make sense. And Cherson also does have some real value as a place which is close to the grain supply, since Constantinople had, a larger population than its local, environment could sustain with grain. Anyway, that is Justinian's war and peace record in the second reign. While the sources portray Justinian as a madman who had no plans and was not really capable of rational thought, as Constance's head shows, there is plenty of evidence that he had a foreign policy, and that foreign policy was centered around trying to create strong foreign alliances which would keep Byzantium out of war. Now, we do know that his efforts with the Bulgars were successful, at least with Tervel and his Bulgars to the north of the Danube. Tervel not only supported Justinian in reclaiming power, but also remained a staunch ally and sent him reinforcements during a conflict in the year 711. Now, Justinian also made major overtures to the Umayyad Caliphate, including sending a lot of skilled craftsmen to Damascus to help build a major mosque. However, as we've already noted, from 709 onward, the Arabs were launching a full-scale offensive against Justinian and the Byzantine homeland of Asia Minor and making major progress, so obviously that effort failed. And in general, his diplomacy was mostly unsuccessful. One thing that he did pull off that I didn't list here is that he actually had the last official papal visit to the east, and at least to the east, for a emperor of Byzantium, where he had the Pope from Syria visit, and they had a meeting, but that was shortly before he was overthrown, and it didn't really end up accomplishing much. Now, one example of the state of his officer corps is that there was a young man who later became the Emperor Leo III, and Justinian basically appointed him to power because Leo was someone who had been generous to Justinian on one of his campaigns that had turned south by giving him and his army a large number of sheep. Later on, Leo was accused of treason and plotting against Justinian, but Justinian at the trial realized that Leo wasn't guilty and he had him pardoned, and then appointed him ambassador. However, if you look at the track record of diplomacy under Justinian during the second reign, you see that Leo might not have been the best diplomat, since none of Justinian's agents seemed to get a lot of things done. Let's revisit the issue of Justinian II's support for small farmers over large landowners. Now, this seems to have been a policy which continued into his second regime from his first, and the most obvious motive that he might have had for such a thing would be the fear of decentralized power and the fear of local aristocrats becoming strong enough to break away and do their own thing. This whole policy of supporting small farmers was something which a lot of Byzantine emperors tried, and the difference, though, is that it seems like Justinian might have gone a little far with it, and that he alienated aristocrats in a way that other emperors didn't. At least Constance's head seems to think that conditions in the empire in general were starting to shift to a point where small farmers were favored. But again, I'm not an expert on either agriculture or Byzantine agriculture, so I can't really say much else. One thing that I can say is that the favoring of small farmers over large landowners really came to its peak in the 10th century, especially under emperors like Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer, when the small farmer in Byzantium really had his heyday, and when the power of the landlords was at its lowest point. So how did Justinian II fall for the second time? Well, let's recap what had happened. The first expedition that Justinian had sent up north had defected to the Khazars, and that expedition had been headed by a general named Helios. The second expedition had gone up there and failed to defeat the first and the Khazar allies, and then it too had effectively defected since it realized that coming home would be suicidal. And the reason why the second expedition knew that it couldn't come home safely is because in the meantime Justinian II had executed the family of General Helios, the leader of the first expedition. Now, this was a brutal world full of brutal people, but the execution of someone's family for their actions was something that was not very common. So this is something which may have alienated people from Justinian, but more to the point made them fear him and fear having to report failure to him. So they thought it would be safer to start a revolt and try to take him out than to go home and await his mercy. This expedition appointed the Armenian-born Vardon as their leader, and he took the Greek name Philip. And he sailed in and captured Constantinople while Justinian was away, which made it very easy. Justinian was actually fighting off a revolt in Asia Minor, which he assumed had been funded by Vardon, but it actually was not, most likely. What happened is Justinian takes his army out of Asia Minor and he's trying to storm back to Constantinople, but an army under Helios comes out and they offer a general amnesty for anyone who leaves Justinian and comes back to Vardon. And almost all of Justinian's army is willing to do that. They realize that the emperor who holds Constantinople has a major advantage, and we have to presume that because of the record of defeat that Justinian had been amassing in recent years, that his prestige was very low. Not to mention what we already talked about, the fact that he's not very much fun. He's a guy who tried to ban everything that's cool. So eventually, he and his hardcore followers, the guys who helped him out during his time at Cherson, who never abandoned him even when he was betrayed by the Khazars, these guys fought with him to the end, and they died fighting. But Justinian was captured, and he was executed by decapitation at the hands of Helios himself. And Justinian was refused Christian burial and had his corpse tossed into the sea in the year 715. Now, this is especially interesting considering that Justinian II was a die-hard Christian who was so dedicated that he actually put Christ on a coin for the first time in history. But yet he was refused Christian burial and thrown into the sea as someone who was seen by his opponents, at least, as almost an apostate. Even though, as we talked about, the church did honor him for some time. Now, the fate of his son is kind of sad, just as with Helios's family. Young Tiberius, who was the co-emperor, was only about 6 years old and clearly hadn't done anything wrong. So his grandmother, Anastasia, had taken Tiberius to a church for sanctuary, and she begged the officials who came to arrest the young emperor for mercy. But they would have nothing of it, since they wanted to exterminate the line of Justinian II Rhinometus, and they removed the boy from the church and took him outside and cut him down where he stood, right in front of Anastasia. And that is what ended the Heraclean dynasty in the line of Justinian II. Let's wrap it up with a bit of discussion of Justinian's legacy and an assessment of him as an emperor. Now, one thing that he did that was long-lasting, and it's something that he accomplished relatively early on in his first reign, was that he set up a revenue-sharing scheme for Cyprus whereby the Byzantines and the Arabs would share the revenue from Cyprus, but neither side would occupy it. Surprisingly, this arrangement lasted for 2 or 3 centuries, and it was something which was considered acceptable to both parties and also to the Cypriots themselves. So it was considered a win-win-win, and it's one of the wisest policies of this period, and one of the most long-lasting. Because of Justinian II's success at coming back from having his nose slit, future emperors who were deposed would be blinded. Because if you're blinded, you certainly can't reign, and that's something that no one ever overcame. So in that sense, Justinian was a pioneer, but not one who helped his future successors. The Heraclean theme system is something that Justinian maintained, and he may have improved upon it in some ways. He may have extended the extent of some of them in his early victories. So in that sense, he is partly responsible for the system, which eventually would help people like Basil the Bulgar Slayer to field large armies. There's also a big difference in his first and second reigns. All of the important things that he did were in his first reign, such as the Cyprus revenue sharing scheme and his military victories, whereas he's actually known for coming back out of exile and for the acts of cruelty committed in his second reign. So his legacy comes from the second reign in terms of what people know him for, but in terms of why he actually matters, all of that stuff is from the first time he was in power. Let's look at some possible interpretations. Sort of the most popular version is that he was a raving psychopath, just this raving loon, an out-of-control, revenge-hungry maniac who cared nothing for governance and only cared for smiting his enemies. I think that Constance Head has done a pretty good job of refuting that view, and I think that even if you look at his second reign, it's pretty clear that that's an unfair assessment, and that he did a lot of important things, and that he was at least trying his best in the second term, even if he didn't do what he set out to accomplish. There's also the view that he was irresponsible and unpopular, the view that maybe he wasn't crazy, but that he just wasn't all that responsible of a ruler, and that he failed to connect with people. The thing is, I think he probably was unpopular, but you got to remember he was only unpopular with the people of the city and at various times with his armies. He also had a very strong relationship with the church because he was a Puritan. So he wasn't unpopular with everyone, and he was also very popular in Thessalonica, so we have to be a little careful about making broad generalizations. The view of Constance's head is that he was a conscientious but flawed ruler. He tried his best, and he made good-intentioned, well-intentioned efforts to improve his empire and to advance the interest of the state, but ultimately his character flaws held him back. His hot temper, his impetuousness, his unforgivingness, these things really held him back, and these qualities were exacerbated by the rhinocopia, which made him a bit vengeful and hateful. My view is that Constance's head is basically right, but I also think we need to examine the scenario that he was playing in. He was operating in a world where it was difficult for a Byzantine ruler to succeed. And he came to power at the age of 16, which, even though it was the age of manhood back then, he still would have been a little better off had he had more time to gain some experience before taking power. And I think that there is an argument to be made that he had an inadequate skill set. If you look at the successes he had during the first reign, when there were still a lot of veteran administrators, tax collectors, and generals around, you see that he's able to accomplish things. He's got all this energy and he's got ambition, but he also has people who can help him execute. During his second reign, after he executed all those people who had served him, then served his usurpers, he had no capable officers around, and he's, promoting people like Leo III who are grossly unqualified for what they're doing. And then he's not winning any battles. And he doesn't seem to be making very many successful negotiations. I think that this shows that he was very dependent on his servants, maybe to an extent that a truly great ruler wouldn't be. Anyway, I think that Justinian II is a fascinating guy. I think that most of what people think about him is wrong. I don't think he was either a badass or a psychopath. I mean, what kind of badass tries to ban dancing, dice playing, and acting? That doesn't really accord with my vision of a badass. Anyway, I'm sure the conversation could go on, but I'm going to wrap it up. I'm Thersites the Historian, and I will be back with you again soon to talk about other topics of historical import.